Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. Today's show, we're going to go deeper into Israel-Palestine conflict and what it means for the world today. And something new you're going to see in this video, which you have never heard it before on the show, on any of the YouTube channels. Do like, share, subscribe, and let me know your feedback. How do you see this video? So let us welcome our special guest, Carpentier. Let's welcome Com. Namaste and welcome.
Namaskar. Nice to be back.
Nice to be back finally in a studio. So Com, tell me one thing. What is something which people don't know about this conflict, actually, Israel-Palestine war, and which you have discussed in your Vivekananda International think tank and other think tanks which you're connected?
I don't know if people know or don't know some of the things I'm going to say. I haven't invented anything, obviously, so some of this information is readily available. Some other facts may be harder to find, but people should and are able to make their own due diligence. However, for those who haven't really looked carefully at the subject, they know, most of what they know is that there is yet another very bloody conflict between the Palestinians and Israel, and particularly between Hamas and Israel. Now, the issue of the Palestinians seemed to have receded into the background in the last few years because a series of agreements had been etched between the Israelis and the neighboring Arab states. And therefore, it looked like the Palestinians had to settle for whatever they had been given or could be given. And their future didn't look very bright as far as a Palestinian state is concerned, because clearly the Israelis have been relentlessly eating into the West Bank, taking more and more of it, and ignoring all the United Nations resolutions which confirmed the Palestinian ownership of most of the land that the Israelis have been taking over to build settlements. So that was the situation. And as far as Gaza is concerned, we all know that there were more than 2 million people who were enclosed in a very narrow strip of land, and that they had very little control over their destiny because their borders, their airspace, their port, their seafront was controlled by the Israeli military. And they had only one short border with Egypt, which was closed most of the time. So clearly it was not a tenable situation in the long term. But it also looked like an impossible thing to resolve because Gaza Strip has been for several years under the political control of Hamas. And Hamas has taken a very tough line that they will not stop fighting Israel until Israel returns the land which were theirs, which means essentially that Israel would have to cease to exist. So between the Israeli position and the hardline Palestinian Hamas position, there is simply no compromise so far. So naturally, the last attack came as a big surprise. I'm talking about the 7th of October Hamas attack on the southern Israeli settlements near the border. And now we know a lot more than what we were told in the very first days after October the 7th. We know that the Hamas attack was planned for a long time, that's obvious, but there were quite a few facts that were made, given out like certainties in the very first days after the attack, which have turned out not to be accurate. As always in such military or terrorist operations, there is an element of surprise. And in the case of Hamas, they, for example, didn't know that there was a big rave party going on right next to the border on the Israeli side. And when they saw it, they obviously attacked and killed as many people as they could, and they took a lot of them prisoners as hostages. And with regard to the settlements, I mean the actual kibbutzim close to the border, they also attacked them and killed a lot of people. And their twin goal was to kill as many as possible, but also to take a lot of hostages to force Israel into some kind of negotiation. Of course, what went horribly wrong is that the Israelis who were caught napping, there was an obvious and complete failure of intelligence. Once they woke up, which was a bit too late, they launched into a counterattack, and it seems that they were extremely undiscriminating because they killed a lot of their own people. There were helicopters that flew over the land where the rave party was being held, and they shot at whoever they could get, including at the cars. And as a result, a lot of Israelis were killed in what we call friendly fire, by their own people. That is now acknowledged as a result of an investigation conducted by the newspaper Haaretz and supported by evidence provided by Israeli intelligence and by the police. Now, this obviously has put Israel in a very difficult position because they were already accused of being negligent, unprofessional, and simply unprepared, even though they should have been prepared because they got advance warnings. And you cannot prepare an attack on the scale that Hamas mounted without letting some things out. And obviously, the Israelis have the ability to watch and listen to everything that is being said or done in the Gaza Strip. Remember, Gaza Strip is something smaller than New Delhi in terms of expansion, in terms, of size. So for the Israelis to have no idea about what was going on in Hamas is even more strange if you consider that Hamas's leadership is based in Qatar. And Qatar, which hosts a big US base, obviously has to communicate through some electronic means with their people in Gaza. Therefore, there must have been some communication that would have at least given a hint that some attack was being prepared. And yet the Israelis were caught completely unprepared. And when they reacted ferociously but brutally at their own cost. And of course, now they have gone into this very ruthless bombing and crushing campaign, trying to basically wipe out Gaza and saying we have to get rid of Hamas, which means we have to get rid of a lot of the Palestinians. And those who survive will have to go somewhere else. We don't want them here anymore. We will occupy it. I mean, the Israeli goal is not clear, and the strategy is not particularly understandable, but they seem to be acting mostly under the impulse of rage and the desire for revenge, which is understandable. After all, they have suffered another series of atrocities. But we also have to take into account that Netanyahu, who is a very unscrupulous politician, I don't think anybody will deny that, even people who are very supportive of Israel, and he himself has been caught various times for corruption, incompetence, and a very self-serving, self-interested politics. So now he's also fighting for his own political survival. And he's trying to gain credit by saying that, I am defending Israel. Everybody should rally around me. I am fighting for the civilized world. But everybody knows that he is actually guilty, at the very least, of negligence. And let's face it, Mr. Netanyahu, over the last few years, has actually undermined Israel in various ways. Everybody who knows the situation will generally agree with me on this. It has been in the mainstream media. Netanyahu has weakened the judicial system by opposing it with his own political program. And he has also undermined the intelligence and the military organizations of the state of Israel, which means that now he's left with a very divided country with a lot of people who essentially hate him, even at the top levels of the military and of the intelligence, and who think he should be removed. And he's simply refusing to go. He will try to stay as long as he possibly can. But unfortunately, the best thing for Israel now would be to change the prime minister and get somebody who is more responsible and who has less, let's put it this way, who has a less heavy baggage as far as financial and political misbehavior. Unfortunately, we don't know when that will happen. And meanwhile, a lot more people will die. And we all know that Israel is now fighting on two fronts. They are fighting in the south, and they're also fighting in the north, where a lot of Israelis have been killed and wounded, even though they are not really letting it out. Of course, they have killed a lot of Lebanese from the Hezbollah and civilians who are in that area. But the fact is that they have also suffered major casualties. And now they are even being attacked with ballistic missiles. I mean, one ballistic missile came from Yemen, at least one, and they were able to shut it down with their own system, but we are not sure that this will be the case for the next missiles. So Israel doesn't seem to have much of a solution except to keep fighting and try to get the US and other Western countries to come to the rescue. But that's not entirely clear because even the US is very hesitant to get involved beyond the point.
No, it is like I was listening to their testimony where the Senate members from the Israeli parliament were meeting with the hostage families, and it was literally a shouting match. And I, you know, the democratic countries have to prove a lot of things to prove their democratic credentials while even responding to an attack on them. And while terrorists have a bigger media say, well, what I see is the Palestinians have completely taken over the media narrative in all the world. In fact, despite being not being a state, actually, not being funded by the state. So who is actually funding these people? I don't know.
I think that's fairly clear. The Hamas organization is primarily funded by Qatar, and that is an agreement which was made between the United States, Israel, and Qatar that Hamas should be kept alive because it, one, essentially provides a counterweight to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Fatah, which is very, I would say, moribund now in terms of its political and also its economic capabilities, because it has not proven capable to solve the Palestinians' problems, and it has settled for a very quiet form of administration on the West Bank with some form of collaboration with Israel and some verbal protest at the United Nations, but nothing much else has happened. So Hamas has taken the mantle of the fight for the Palestinian rights, and as a result, it has acquired a lot of prestige in the Muslim world. And when I say the Muslim world, I of course include Turkey, which is closely aligned with Qatar and which very clearly has a strong bond with Hamas through the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan, who are, you might say, the source of inspiration for Hamas. Now, interestingly, what you see now is a convergence between the Sunnis and the Shias, at least at some level. You see it between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and you see it between Hamas and Hezbollah, and a few other organizations which have joined the fight, including the Houthis, who are another kind of Shia denomination, but they also have become now very active participants in the war, and they may even send troops. There is a talk about some Taliban coming over. That's not yet very realistic, but who knows? So as a result, now there is a growing mobilization of the Muslim world for the liberation of the Holy Land. And facing that, we see the West that is definitely turning increasingly against Israel. Not against Jews per se. This is not so much an issue of anti-Semitism. It is a matter of fatigue and anger with the policies of Israel, and particularly with the current political coalition in Israel. Because, you are facing people who are what you might call extremist Zionists, who are very unreasonable and who start from the principle that they will be supported by America no matter what they do. This is what Netanyahu said many times, like his patron, some other politicians said the same, including General Ariel Sharon. He says, don't even pay attention to what anybody's saying, just do what you have to do, and the Americans are behind you anyway. So even the Americans, I think, are becoming quite wary with that narrative, and there is increasing contestation. Now, for the bad luck of the Israelis, it happens that the Biden administration is heavily dependent on the left wing of the Democratic Party. And the left wing of the Democratic Party, which is very woke, is now increasingly pro-Palestinian and anti-Jewish, even though many of them are actually Jews, but they defend themselves as liberal. The growing problem in Israel, which I think has been ignored, which is the fact that a very large proportion of the Israeli population is made up of very orthodox, old school, traditional Jews, the Haredim. And those people are not only against the policies of Israel, but they are against Israel itself, period. They feel Israel should not exist. It should be the Holy Land awaiting for the return of the Messiah. And these people, for example, have good relations with some other sects of Jews who are all over the world, for example, in Iran, where you have a large Jewish community that is generally anti-Israeli. Of course, they have reasons to be, because being in Iran, they have to affirm a certain political line. But they also traditionally regard Israel as a sort of a sacrilegious entity, because it was not created with the permission of God. It was made as a sort of a secular state that was supposed to ignore the Bible's commandments, you see. So that's the situation that Israel is in now, caught between what we call the traditionalists and the leftists. And I think Israel's future is not looking bright. And several very well-known experts have said so, including John Mearsheimer, who said 6 years ago he made a very prophetic speech in Washington, D.C., and he said, you see, Israel is facing a very dark future. So he could see already that things were going to get worse for Israel. Why? Because Israel has lost its dominance militarily in the Middle East. It no longer has the ability to crush its enemies alone. And on the other hand, there is a growing uncertainty about the amount of support that Israel will get from the West. And let's face it, the West is the only part of the world, which means North America and Western Europe, where Israel has a strong constituency. Most of Africa, most of the developing countries, most of South America is now, you might say, not anti-Israeli, but they certainly do not approve of Israel's policies. And they are not willing to support Israel at any cost.
I don't understand one thing, that the whole land before 1947, there was no word Palestine. Palestine word was not there. And I've searched the history, I've searched everywhere, no, not there. And the Arabic population refused to take Palestinian refugees. 7 major Arab nations have refused to take Palestinians as refugees. But the West is inviting more than 1 million of them back to Europe and USA. Now, what will happen to USA and Europe when these highly radicalized Palestinian population reaches there? What do you think?
First, I would have to deny, or at least disagree with your view that there was no such thing as Palestine. Palestine is a very clearly mentioned geographic and cultural and social entity in most of the literature about the Middle East from the 16th century onwards. It just happens that the Ottoman Empire controlled all that part of the world. So there was no Palestine,
but that was mostly a Greek name. It's a Greek name.
No, it's not. It's the Philistines, and the Philistines are much prior to the Greeks. And actually, the Philistines kept the identity of the land, because the Philistines are related to the Canaanians, and the Canaanians were the first occupiers. Even the Bible tells you that the Israelis conquered the land from the Canaanians. So clearly, they have at least as much right as the Jews to at least part of that land. But the other thing is that if you look at the map in the 18th century, naturally, there was no Arab country. And even Egypt was not a country. It was part of the Ottoman Empire, and so was Iraq, so was Syria. In fact, Iraq's name was not even referred to. Syria kept its identity, but it was like Palestine, a region, a province of the Ottoman Empire. So, when you look at Napoleon's campaigns in the Near East, he very much mentions when he went into Palestine. And obviously, at that time, there was no such thing as Israel. There were Jewish colonies. But if you look at very old Jewish colonies that had remained there in Hebron, in Israel, in Jerusalem. But if you look at the way in which the writers in the 19th century talked about the Holy Land, and if you look at the photographs they took and at the paintings they made, you see that it was very much a Middle Eastern land with Christians, Jews, Armenians, Greeks, Russians, in vast variety of population. I traveled quite a lot in Jordan and some other places near there, and there are still villages inhabited by Africans because they came with the Ottoman armies. And when the Ottoman armies went through these territories, they left some of them there to settle down. So it's a very mixed population. And obviously, the Israelis have had to take some of them in because they couldn't kick all of them out. So they have the Druze, they have Palestinian Christians, they have Palestinian Muslims. But the fact is that you cannot sort of sweep them under the carpet and decide that nothing was there until the Israelis came. In fact, Golda Meir made a famous statement. She said, I was a Palestinian before I became an Israeli, because at that time there was no such thing as Israel. So it was well understood that this was clearly the creation of a new country, which in the spirit of the late 19th century was very much in order, because all the colonies of the Western nations had been taken over from other people, whether it's the United States, Canada, South America, Africa, you name it, even India. It had all been taken over. Therefore, the fact that some part of land was taken over for the Jews to settle in was considered quite normal. It was in the spirit of spreading civilization. Now, it just happens that the world view has changed now. And as you know, Americans are now being accused of having stolen land from Indians. And from the Israelis side, there is also a very difficult position, because many of them come from Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, United States, Western Europe, and therefore their claim to the Holy Land is somewhat questionable. But this being said, you cannot keep remaking history. So let's agree that the Israelis, at least many of them, have a right to live there. The question is, how do they make a settlement with the Palestinians?
No, I again checked my notes actually.
So that's a thing which has not been resolved in 80 years. And from what we see, it's getting worse. It's not getting better, it's getting worse.
No, I again checked my notes after you told me about the history. Palatsu, Palashtu, and Pilista. These are different names used over here in the notes I was checking. And you're right, actually. It was in the 5th century. It was a non-Arab land. 7th century, non-Arab land. 12th century, non-Arab land. And in the 15th century, it's said to be a Jewish land. And also it is considered the cradle of Christianism. And Jesus of Nazareth in the 16th century. Now there, if you go back to the old Parthian and other empires, the Second Temple in Jerusalem, again it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 Common Era. So anyway, which was a Jewish-Roman war. We all know that Jesus was established in that time in the same land. So if somebody says Palestine, it doesn't come as Arab. Like, I never understood that Palestine is an Arab nation. I never understood that. But now I see that the old Hebrew name or old Egyptian name as a neighboring Egypt, it was already known as neighboring Egypt, like outskirts of Egypt.
It had been conquered by Egypt. It was administered by Egypt for quite a few centuries. It was actually a matter of dispute between Egypt and Syria for at least 1,500 years, because the dynasties that the Greeks had implanted in Egypt and Syria kept fighting over Palestine. And sometimes it went to Egypt, and sometimes it went to Syria. But, this is true of not only of the Middle East, but of the whole world. The world is a patchwork. What country can say, "Oh, we are the only owners of this place"? It's so relative, because clearly Arabs came in large numbers when Islam took over the Byzantine Empire, and they settled among the locals. Now the question is, who is local and who is a more recent immigrant? When somebody has been there for 1,000 years, you can hardly treat him as an immigrant. And in fact, if you look at some of the descriptions that were given, there is a famous Israeli historian who says that most Palestinians are Jews who converted to Islam, whereas many of the Jews who settled, who were in North Africa, and many of them came to Israel after 1947, these Jews, he says, are actually converted North Africans. So there may be a portion of non-Semitic Jews and a portion of course, all Arabs are Semites too. So when you hear from the West, "Oh, this is anti-Semitism," it's quite paradoxical, because at least a big part of the Palestinian people is Semitic as well. So you can say that this is a fight between Semites. And then you can go even further into genetic analysis and find that a lot of the Ashkenazi Jews are not Semites. They just became Jews from religious conversion, which means then that you are dealing with maybe a high proportion of Semites on one side and a lower proportion of Semites on the other. So in the end, it doesn't make a lot of sense. You people have to either agree to live together or not. And unfortunately, religion is a big obstacle to living together in many cases.
Now, coming to the new words being used, like
as we all know. So even if you say this is not about religion, this is about, but it's still the religious factor, clearly, that plays a role.
So the new words which is being used now by the American academics mostly, settler colonialism, and the denial of the settlers need to go back. Now, if I use the same word on America, Australia, USA, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, then by that definition, everyone needs to go back. Everyone. I mean, same logic is being used over there, because all these lands have been also been colonized by settlers, and they are known in the history as settlers. So what do you think the larger repercussions of these new terms being coined on the colonial agenda of the world, like the colonial world, like the what happened to natives of USA or Canada, or Aborigines of Australia and Maoris of New Zealand? So the same settler colonialism can be applied to them too. What do you think?
Indeed. But you see, it's all a matter of the time frame and a matter of arithmetics. The Jews, in a sense, are unlucky in Israel because they came too late, and there are not that many. I mean, there's no way that you can now say, let's bring the American territory back to the Indians, because there are very few Indians left. And there are 300 million Americans of various origins, most of whom are not Native American. And therefore, that's a done deal. It's a fact. I mean, you can't, facts on the ground, as they say. And you can say the same about the British, who is Danish and who is Saxon and who is Gaelic. There is no end to it. The question in the case of Israel-Palestine is that it's a very recent issue, and it hasn't been allowed to settle. If things had happened 300 years ago, this whole issue would have died out. But you see, I can give you the example of Algeria, which was not only a French colony, but had been made legally a part of France. It was officially as French as Brittany, and yet the French had to leave from Algeria after a very bloody civil war. Because they were seen as intruders, which they were, although they had been there for 150 years. Now, the question is, 150 years may not make you a legal settler, but does, in that case, 70 years does not make it either, and maybe 500 years doesn't make it. So it all depends upon how you are able to integrate yourself in a population and how many are there on either side, in the sense that if the Jews had been able to essentially create a composite society with the locals, I don't think this problem would have persisted. The problem is that, by definition, the Israeli settlers are literal readers of the Torah, and they believe that they have a right to live there only among themselves and that everybody else should clear out. I'm not saying this about the Israeli mainland, I'm saying this about the colonies. So as a result, they have been pushing the Palestinians out through every possible means, destroying their olive trees so that they can't grow food, baiting them up, burning their wheat fields. I mean, they do that. It's completely acknowledged and recognized. And they do that so that all the Palestinians clear up and that they're left alone there. Naturally, this is evoking very strong reactions. And in the case of Palestinians, they are a very unyielding people. If they had been Hindus or Buddhists, they might have sort of found the way out. But in the case of Palestinians, they are very proud of what they call their attachment to the soil. There is even a Palestinian word for that. And that means that you just don't move from where you were born. You are rooted there like a tree. And they have to kill you to get you out. And even if they kill you, your children will keep on holding to what you have or what you had. And this is where the Jewish settler mindset comes against a wall, because they cannot convince these people that, okay, you just clear out, you are not strong enough, we are the newcomers and you should defer to us. So what do you do? I mean, this is going to end up in violence every single time.
No, I think, one thing is very clear based on our discussion right now. Two American allies are fighting. One is Qatar and one is Israel. I mean, Qatar is a direct funder of Hamas, and the Americans control it to a large extent. Qatar has no power without a USA, and Qatar is also heavily invested into American economy also in many ways by university funding, and they are funding the whole.
And in Europe, they are massively invested in Britain and France particularly.
Yeah, a small oil-rich nation, and they're doing that. And the second is the Hamas, and the Israel, which is also an American ally, and the Palestinian pride. I mean, I've sometimes really questioned one thing, that how can violence against children be justified, and what is being said that it's a bravery. It's like a weak point where attacking women and children, old people, to claim that their land is there, and the whole concept of attacker and defender is also gone, where the attacker is actually now being glorified in the media and the academic circles, which is really surprising for me. What do you have to say? And we'll close up the discussion after that.
Yeah, but you see what happened now in modern wars, because there is no clear separation between the fighters and the local populations. So the local populations get bombed because when you are using, in a way now, so-called democratic countries, at least, or in fact most countries, have a real taboo, which is not to get too many of their own people killed, whether they are soldiers or civilians. Therefore, you cannot send people to fight head to head if you can avoid it. So what will you do? You will bomb an entire area and hope that everybody who could harm your people is dead. So naturally, you kill a lot of innocent people in the process. And because it's well known that people hide in hospitals, and especially guerrilla fighters, they hide wherever they feel they may be safe. So naturally, you have to go after the hospitals and after all the humanitarian facilities. By the way, this is exactly what happened in Ukraine. The Europeans were shouting hoarse, oh, the Russians are bombing Ukrainian civilian facilities. But the Ukrainian army was systematically hiding, if you want to call it that way, in civilian facilities, hoping to escape Russian bombings. So the strategies are being applied because they are the only ones that can enable you to win and to defeat your enemy and not to get too many of your people killed. So no matter what you say about it, morally speaking, it's not going to change the facts on the ground. And I feel that what's happening now is really that Israel is caught in the very downfall of American power. You see, Israel had put all its eggs in the American basket, maybe with a little more help from countries like Germany, England, France, which are not really in a position to do much in terms of military support. So by becoming so dependent on the Americans, the Israelis are now being caught in the American, they are simply fighting them because they are seen as allies of the Americans, period. And that is very clear if you look at the configuration of forces. You see, Qatar has been surviving to its double or treble. It has a military alliance with Turkey, and it is therefore in the middle. And Qatar has been able, through its money, we're not hit too hard by the Americans. They really protected them, and they made sure the Taliban survived and went on to rule Afghanistan. So this is the Qatari game. But why can they play this game? Because there are a number of countries, including Iran, Turkey, and even Russia and China, which feel it's very convenient to have an American defeat on the ground, one after another. So Ukraine, America already acknowledges defeat. Afghanistan, defeat. The next one will probably be Israel. It will be a form of defeat because Israel will have to basically settle for some sort of very uneasy peace and then face the music as far as the enormous amount of criticism it is getting for its campaign against Gaza. I mean, there's no question, even if you have agreed that taking them to international court is not going anywhere, it is still there. I mean, they are going to be prosecuted. At least Netanyahu will be, and some of his ministers will be. Now, does that make any sense? Well, no, because now everybody can take everybody else to the international court, and most of the countries that matter are not even a member, so they don't really mind. They can ignore it. The only ones who get caught are the poor Africans who have nobody to protect them and who can always be accused of crimes against humanity because nobody is going to defend them. So as a result, you see, you have a very unfair world order, and the Israelis may not risk so much because of the protection they enjoy from the West, but it's still a very, very bad reputation to have. And I think they're going to find themselves increasingly isolated. They have created another ghetto, which is exactly where the Israelis, unfortunately, always historically end, in ghettos where they don't want to, they can't get out, and nobody wants to come in, and they end up living in a sort of autarcy, which is not particularly healthy.
It's true that the justice is definitely a question mark in today's times, and people who are expecting justice don't understand all the players behind it, and which is the problem today. And it's unfortunate that the all kinds of media reports which are coming out of this entire conflict. I think this is the most honest discussions we ever had in any channels today. You and I, what discussion you had, and there are no winners in this game actually, because Israel is going to lose, Hamas is losing in any way, and Qatar is also going to lose big way, and the USA is also going to lose big way. So I mean, we are looking at 4 people losing, and also the supporters of these countries are also going to lose in a big way. I think the only intelligent people remaining in this conflict are the people who are outside the conflict, who are not have nothing to do with the conflict.
Yes.
And the people who are taking neutral positions, they are the actual winners, and the losers are.
Yeah.
With this human tragedy, I think everyone is a loser. By the way, this which is going on right now in both sides, Israeli side as well as Palestinian side, both sides are losers. Anyway, thank you, Kom, for coming on the show, and thank you for really.
Yes, I think that this is a disaster and a tragedy. On the longer term, I think both China and Russia will gain some advantages on the ground. Turkey may also win make some essentially headway, impose further its own political objectives, and of course the West is already a loser, and particularly America, in terms of prestige, in terms of credibility, and in terms of appearing to support at any cost a country which can no longer maintain itself on its own, you see, which is Israel. So you are dealing with another, a situation in which the Americans look like they are on the wrong side of history, as they like to say about others. You are on the wrong side of history. Now they look very much like they're on the wrong side of history.
And there are a lot of my friends who are yogis in USA, and I will say the yoga is coming to be a rescue actually, where all sides need to start practicing yoga. Qatar, USA, Israel, Palestine, and everybody else. So we need to calm down our nerves and little bit think for the better. I think all these wars nowadays have no real benefits for anyone other than the military industrial complex, which is selling weapons on all sides of the war right now.
Indeed, absolutely, no question about that.
Because the weapons, the Palestinian terrorists are also fighting with a weapon, American-made weapon, and Israel is also fighting with the American-made weapon, and it's like a comedy actually, in terms of a very sad comedy in a way, where if an independent person views at it and says, I mean, everyone is losing here. Everyone is losing. Despite some people making some money on the American stock market, which is the only benefit for some people, which is a small minority. Anyway, thank you, Com, and thank you for all the viewers for watching. And do like, share, subscribe. Let us know your feedback, and I look forward to hearing from you. Namaste.
Namaste. Thank you. Bye-bye.